Welcome to World Business. Now, artificial intelligence is back in the spotlight this week as the world's most valuable company, Nvidia, kicks off its annual GTC conference in San Jose. Now, the event is expected to give us a clearer sense of where the AI industry is heading next. And joining me now is Steve Dickens, Chief Executive Officer and Principal Analyst at Hyperframe Research, a firm that closely tracks enterprise technology, semiconductors, and the fast-moving AI market. Steve, very good indeed to have you with us. Steve, everybody knows the name Nvidia, don't they? The world's most valuable company by market cap, depending on what time of day you check. But just explain the function, if you will, of this GTC event and why it's become so important.
So, Guy, NVIDIA's GPU Technology Conference, that's what GTC stands for, is the gathering point for the AI industry. So we're going to see all the big vendors this week. We're going to see Lenovo, HP, Dell, Cisco, IBM, everybody's going to be there at this event. We're going to have AWS, we're going to have Microsoft. The amount of announcements we've been pre-briefed on by the teams ahead going into this week, I'm expecting Jensen's keynote to set the tone for the next maybe 6 months in this industry. This is how seminal it is. There's going to be a number of different announcements from the company, their partnership with Grok and the IP licensing deal they did earlier on in the year. We're going to see that come through with an LPU, a language processing unit. So this is really a foundational moment. This is the biggest company in AI announcing their roadmap, which will define downstream what we're going to see across the entire industry.
Yeah, massive, as you say. And you mentioned there the CEO, Jensen Huang. He's frankly rarely out of the spotlight. A lot, as you say, has already been signaled this year, hasn't it, in terms of the overarching strategy. But then again, the geopolitical turbulence has been vast, hasn't it? So just walk us through the big themes at GTC this year.
So I talked about it really briefly. I think the big thing we're going to be seeing is a pivot away from training to inference. So we've heard about these large language models, these frontier models. We've heard about ChatGPT. We've heard about Anthropic. They've been in the news, particularly with a spat with the US government. Then we've also got Google, and there's a number of other of these frontier models, what Meta's doing with Llama. So you look at these frontier models, that's where the action has been in the first 2 years of AI. But we're now pivoting to this inference. This is the using of AI, not the training of AI. Then you look at agentic, what's going on in the enterprise. And then we're probably sort of fast after those two is going to be physical and AI and robotics, not just training and using things that write, but also things that move. So I think if you're looking for the big three themes, it's going to be that pivot to inference, it's going to be agentic enterprise, and then it's going to be physical AI and robots. Those are the three things that I think Jensen's going to be wearing his leather jacket on stage talking about later on today.
And Steve, other than the leather jacket, many analysts have been talking about the fact that, or potentially that Nvidia might be too big to fail. And they've dominated the AI chip market for the past couple of years, haven't they? But do you see that position of strength changing anytime soon?
Well, I think they've got to nail the landing with inference. That's where the market's going to go to. We're seeing the hyperscalers building out their in-house custom silicon. You were seeing this with Google with its TPU. That's now being sold. So AMD's catching up. So we've also not really seen Intel in this race. Inference is good for CPU. So do they come back in? So I don't think, whilst training has been absolutely locked in for NVIDIA, inference is still up for discussion. And that's why I think so many people who track the industry are going to be interested in this Grok announcement. They did an interesting deal. Some could argue to get around what the regulators would have imposed on that deal. It was an IP licensing deal for 20 billion, and then a staff transfer. So that interesting transaction, I think, is going to form the basis of what Nvidia does in the inference space. So at 90+% market share in GPU, locked in there from training, inference still up for discussion.
And Steve, for some of our viewers who may not be quite so tech literate, we're hearing a lot more about, as you say, AI inference rather than training models. Just explain a little bit for us what the difference is between those two definitions and why that inference market is now becoming so important.
So, Guy, trying to boil down some deeply techie stuff here, but the way that this works is, from a training point of view, this is a big model, billions of parameters, scraping the internet, ingesting it, and then training a model to get smarter. That takes very, very big infrastructure, lots of Nvidia GPUs. It's a particular type of compute task, and that's where we've seen the first 2 years. This is your OpenAIs, your Llamas, your Anthropics, your Gemini. It's these huge language models. But then when you move to how do you use AI, that's inference. That's being able to put a query in, and the output comes in tokens. Tokens, if you want to think of them, are a word. So the token economics of how you train and how you do inference are very different. It's a different type of computing that's required. And that's why so many people are crucially watching what Nvidia says today around inference. We're starting to see vendors. Lenovo launched inference-specific servers back in January. And this is now, how do we get that token economics to be as cheap as possible as people move AI into production?
Now, Steve, despite being so enormous, Nvidia don't necessarily want to do everything by themselves, do they? They're building a much broader ecosystem, aren't they? Software, networking, data center infrastructure. How central is that to their long-term strategy?
I think the key piece for me is CUDA. This is where their software, and this is how people interact with these systems. That's been a lock and a really strong moat, but we're seeing other players start to come into the market. We're seeing open source, where people, once there's opportunity, other vendors are going to come around that. This is a downstream sort of ripple through the industry. You look at vendors like HPE, you look at vendors like Dell, you look at vendors like Cisco, Lenovo. Those guys are all crucially going to be at this event this week. They're going to be making announcements too. They're looking to get parts of this stack and be able to drive their own revenues and own profits off the top of this. This is wider than just Nvidia. This is an entire ecosystem play, and that's why this event this week is so crucial.
Steve, companies everywhere are talking about adopting AI, aren't they? And from what you're seeing on the ground, are businesses actually rolling this stuff out at scale yet?
So that's the $600 billion question. These big hyperscalers are rolling out infrastructure like we've never seen them before, and people are questioning the AI bubble. The difference for me is back in 99, 2000, when we were talking about the internet bubble, we were building out ahead of demand. I'm chatting to CEOs and chief product officers of some of these cloud companies like CoreWeave, Volta, Nebius, Lambda Labs, and every GPU that they can bring on is being leveraged. So we're not building out into demand that we see in future quarters and future years. We're building into demand that's there today. We're still seeing a lot of these projects transition from POCs, proof of concepts, and experiments. But that, I think, as we talk about inference, that's what's driving the inference demand, that these projects are starting to move to maturity.
And in terms of that mature situation, Steve, AI infrastructure is still incredibly expensive, isn't it? Are companies beginning to worry at all about whether the investment is actually going to pay off anytime soon?
Well, we look at, you've got Oracle on the screen here. You look at Oracle, they've raised $50 billion in debt. to be able to finance what they're doing. But then they just reported earnings last week, stellar demand, company up 20% and growing, their cloud business unit growing exponentially. So you look at this and you go, people were worried about Oracle going into the print. I wasn't, because when you look at some of the fundamentals for that business, it's an accelerant across all of those different parts of their business. And Oracle's just a case in point. We're seeing this across Microsoft. We're seeing this across AWS. We're seeing across a bunch of others. CoreWeave just announced that they got to $5 billion of revenue in a year, the fastest ever cloud growth we've seen, faster than AWS. So when you look at this return on investment, it's paying off for these vendors.
Steve, as you'd expect on A News, we've got to ask at least something about international relations. Governments are increasingly treating AI as a kind of strategic technology, aren't they? How much is geopolitics now shaping the semiconductor industry?
So I think when you look at it, we've got a concentration risk, TSMC, where all of these chips are fabricated. The vast majority of that happens in Taiwan. Obviously, there's tensions there in that region, so people are looking to diversify these supply chains. We're seeing some huge investments in infrastructure to build out fabrication plants in the US. Intel's benefited from a government focus there. We need to see more of that. There still is a supply chain risk. I think the US and China have come to a detente around supply of probably the most appropriate of these GPUs going into that market, and that's driving innovation in the Chinese market as they don't get access to the absolute cutting edge. But I think where we had some challenges a year ago, I think that's largely dissipated. I think the one thing that is still a concern for a lot of people and is constraining some of the earnings and revenue is access to memory. Memory's been a constraint, and these systems all need high bandwidth memory. So companies like Samsung and SK Hynix have been a challenge for the industry, and I think that's probably going to continue for the next 18 months. So whilst I see we're on a more level footing with supply chain, there's still some challenges.
Steve, we're going to be, as you say, there's going to be lots of announcements coming out of the event itself. There'll probably be more announcements in the period just following the event too. As these announcements, as this communication starts to proliferate, what should analysts and investors be paying the closest attention to?
I think I've talked about it before, this pivot to inference. If you're tracking Nvidia stock, this is a company that's got 90% market share in what's been a rapidly expanding market. Are they going to have 90% market share in inference? I don't think so. But can that huge market, which will probably be 10 to maybe even 100 times bigger than the training market, can they capture their share? I think they will. But the question for people tracking this going forward is, will this announcement today that we're largely all expecting around the collaboration with Grok and the IP transfer that came as part of that 20 billion move, will that stick the landing for inference? I'm bullish that it will, but that's the technical factor that's going to be underpinning the trade going forward for the next 6, 9, maybe even 3 or 4 years. So that's going to be the key factor that we're going to be looking for as analysts, and arguably what investors should be looking for as well.
And finally, Steve, it's prediction time, I'm afraid. If you look ahead over that period, as you say, 3 or 4 years, what will be, do you think, the biggest shift in the AI computing market? Will it be this transition that we're seeing to the inference models, or will it be something else?
I think inference is a 2026 pivot. I think that will just be the norm as we exit 26. You've got it on the screen here, and I think it's physical and AI, physical robot and robotics. This is moving AI out to the edge. This is moving from something you interact with primarily via a chatbot or an agentic interface, and something that becomes physical. I think if I was looking at 4 or 5 years, will we start to see more robots? Will we see AI in autonomous vehicles? Will we start to see some of these things start to become the norm? That's, I think, where we're going to end up 4 or 5 years out from now.
Steve, always a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much for your analysis, and we'll catch up with you soon, I'm sure. Well, that wraps up this episode of World Business. Today we looked at Nvidia's GTC conference and what it could reveal about the next phase of artificial intelligence, from the race for more powerful chips to the growing demand for the infrastructure behind them. My thanks to Steve Dickens, CEO of Hyperframe Research, for joining us. From me and the whole team here at A News, thanks for watching.